You're listening to a bonus episode of The Dairy Age, featuring Teagasc's weekly Let's Talk Dairy webinar series, which is also available as a podcast.
Good morning, everybody. You're very welcome to this week's Let's Talk Dairy webinar. We have my colleague, Pat Gowing. Pat is going to have a conversation with me around cost of production, and I suppose, Pat, in terms of managing cash flow and how we might do that for the remainder of 2023. Morning, Pat.
Hi, James. How are you?
We've good news from John, and we're getting you on in ultimately a fall in milk price market. But I think it's important that we maybe have a wee chat. I suppose the reason behind it is obviously there's pressure coming from the global milk prices. Best part of 20 cent, obviously, off base milk price over the last few months. You look at the international markets. I was looking at the US, they're down about 33% on last year's milk price. And the outlook isn't obviously for any big increases over the coming months. So I suppose to start there, Pat, in terms of where ultimately are we at? We've seen big increases in costs last year. I'll not say it was okay, but ultimately it was offset somewhat by a significant increase in base milk price in 2022. But where are we seeing, or where are you projecting costs to be in 2023, I suppose, comparable to that of last year?
Yeah, thanks, James. Yes, look, as we all know, the markets are back, and as you say, last year everything accelerated in costs. So we had the big ones, which is the feed and fertilizer, which jumped the most. But we also had the agri index of inflation is 8%. So you had this thing where all costs were getting a little bit dearer, and the whole thing sort of came together. Obviously, towards the back end of the year, then energy rose. So one with the other, the average cost, and we'll do it on a per cow basis. Now, just on the figures too, James, these are coming off the profit monitor, so it includes the cost of rearing the heifer. So when I quoted per cow, it does include the cost of rearing the heifers with it. And the average last year was just shy of €1,900 a cow. So that rose. That was up by 34%, up substantially from the year previous, and mainly driven by feed and fert. And as you say, milk price kept a par, and if towards the back end of last year, it's only the flip of this year, it just kept going, and the milk checks kept coming in, and people had a good year. And unfortunately, we're in a different situation. But when we look at the costs this year, what we're seeing is, I suppose, we have that creep, if you want to call it, of inflationary costs of everything again. So, vaccines, vet costs, the cost of labour in general in the economy is a little bit dearer, so that's been passed on to all your costs as you move along. You have your energy and ESB. So ESB peaked towards last year, so rose throughout the year, hasn't shifted this year, so we're still on high costs. There's no indication it's going to drop off, so you're going to have a higher ESB year. Interest rates have started to increase over last year as well, so anyone with a level of debt, their interest costs are going to go up a bit. If you are replacing your land, or you're changing your labour, there's an increased cost. Now, if we average that out over the whole industry, the 18,000 dairy farmers, you won't see it because not everyone changes land in the one time, but there is a pressure on that there. So when we look at all them costs from a fixed cost point of view, they're all there, or if not a little bit more. If we move to the variable cost, then we get a similar outlook. So look, AI straws, and you might have a euro on it. Vaccines, they're all just creeping. Contractors probably one that stayed relatively static to the last year, but had risen into last year. And the big two then are feed and fertilizer. And if we look at them, and on average now, feed and fertilizer are making up about close to 40% of the total costs. So they're the big ones. So how they move will determine where your costs are going to go for the year. So feed was high at the start of the year, and it started to slide off. But we front load, as with fertilizer as well, we use a lot of it at the start of the year. So what the cost of it at the start of the year has a big impact for the total year. Fertilizer, the same thing, started very high, it's after dropping off. Indications it might start to rise again, albeit for the amount we used at the end of the year will be very limited, as John was saying. So what you want, one with the other, depending on when you bought your fertilizer, there may be a saving. So some people front load it based on tax advice and based on potential scarcities of fertilizer. So they have incurred it at the high price. Other people then wait and see and probably got the benefit of that decision. and you weigh it all out. Long answer now to a short question. It's coming in around the same thing. So, and the big variant will be is your exposure to the feed, particularly. So if you are a high meal feeder for whatever reason, high stocking rate or whatever system you're in, you potentially will increase because the feed is after driving up the overall. So the savings we're getting feed and fertilizer, I would see on average being ate up by all the other costs just increasing.
Okay. So really, ultimately, you're looking for at very, very similar cost of production for 2023 versus 2022.
Yeah. So look, as I said, the average is about 1900. There was probably a range. Look, there's always a wider range, but you'd catch a lot of people on the bell curve, if you want to call it, within €300 at either side of that. The people that are the higher above the average costs, they will probably increase because they're generally driven by more high feed costs. The lower people then depend on whether fixed cost structure and things like that. But yeah, it's relatively static. Yeah. So
that's one question I was going to say. When we look at the benchmarking across individual farms, I suppose, and using the profit monitor, there's always a range in costs as such. What's the drivers from your point of view in terms of that range in costs at individual farm level, or what are the things maybe that might push you into that high cost bracket?
So the biggest one I think comes down to it is it's how you feed your cow. So we have this. We would have come out in last year's dairy conference, the paper you and I did. It's basically looking at three main costs, which is feed, fertilizer, and contracting, and we classified them as direct feed costs, and they proportioned somewhere between 40 and 50% of total costs. So how you feed your cow, like we can talk about all the other ones and saving €1 here and saving €1 there, but the thing that's driving the costs is how you feed your cow. And if you can control that, you have a chance of controlling your overall costs. And the other thing we would look at from that is like that it was cheaper if you wanted the proportion of them direct feed costs was lower if it came out post quota, it was about 30%. So everything has got dear, it's cost. Look, last year was a particularly bad year, but the way the feed and fertilizer went, but that they're the ones. So and it's particularly feed, if you're exposed to not being able to grow enough grass or whatever it is, maybe a higher stock system, it'll tend to drive a higher cost. Then within that, then there's always nuances. Like, so the problem with averages, it doesn't catch everyone, James. So there's some people maybe they're at an early stage of expansion, so they may have taken on a bit of extra land, a bit of extra debt, maybe a bit of labour, and the output hasn't matched it, and it's just catching. But you'd hope that will fall through the system. There was people's profitability was cost last year was more on a fixed milk price type thing that caught their profitability rather than their cost structure. And Avant, their cost structure was probably more static when they were getting the lower milk price. So there's a whole lot of different reasons why things can happen. And then there's just things go wrong on farms, or a weather event. So there's droughts last year, bits of droughts this year. You had John talk about there's good silage coming in, not as good as quality, so that could have an impact on how much you feed going forward. So there's always these little bit things that can push farmers in and out, but it's mainly driven by how you feed your cow.
So really it comes down to the feed budget and growing enough grass for the animals you have.
So
as always, folks, don't have me asking Pat all the questions. If there's any hard ones that you just want to post in, we will post them to him today. But I suppose there's always then the conversation at individual farm level then, Pat. Ultimately, that's cost of production, okay, and comparable across farms. Break-even costs is something that I've heard a bit about, I suppose, over the last number of months, and it's something that we've had a conversation with our advisors and our farmer clients about. Explain to us a little bit, I suppose, the difference between that kind of cost of production that's often discussed and ultimately then the break-even cost for individual farmers.
Yeah, so the cost that we've been quoting there the last few minutes is off profit monitor, and as with it, that's a management set of accounts. So as with your own tax accounts or a management set of accounts, it's trying to take a picture over time rather than an individual year. So the likes of depreciation and certain costs in, certain costs out. And that's just to, as you said, to be comparable to other people. So it's to try to stabilize it. And the exact same thing happens with your tax accounts. Like, they look at the same type thing. You buy them, do an investment to depreciate over time. Where what we want to look at then is when, particularly in that the management accounts are excellent to see where you're going or you're on the right track. But it's on an individual basis, and particularly in a year when milk prices are sliding, we need to get back and look at from a cash flow point of view. And one metric we use is break-even analysis, which fundamentally we take all cash payments or incomes, I should say, all cash income. So any bit of money that comes into the farm, we total that. Then we get all cash payments. So what we'll be adding back into that there then will be the principal repayments. We'll be knocking out the depreciation because it's not an actual cash cost. We'll add back in tax, we'll add back in drawings, and we'll add back in any capital reinvestment taken out of cash flow. And we get a total cash cost to the farm. Okay, so the total cash payments for that year. And hopefully that'll give you a surplus in cash total, say 30 or 40,000, whatever it is. And we divide that by the total litres produced in the year. That gives you your cash surplus or not. And you basically take that off the base milk price. And that will give you roughly the break-even price, the price that you have to receive from the co-op to cover all costs, including living. Sorry, I should have had drawings to be added into that as well.
No, you did. You mentioned drawings ultimately.
I did mention, sorry, yeah. So it's an indicator of, and I would call it nearly like a pre-warning for yourself. Like it's a very simple thing to figure out. It'll give you an indication of at what point milk price that the farm would struggle to make all payments. And it's an early warning system, James. Like, so if you know early and the thing is approaching, you start reacting. That's just the way it works. Like, so and it's important. It'll change from year to year, obviously, and things like that as well. Like, so the costs change, and you'd work through it. But to me, now is the time to do it. Take a stab at where you are, and when you know where you are, you can start to make corrective action.
Make decisions off the back of it ultimately. You've completed a lot of these over the last number of weeks. Are you going to give me a ballpark figure in terms of where this break-even price is at individual farm level, or what's the? No. Talk to me. You're not going to give me a big figure, Pat.
No figures. Look. And it's on it. We have it. The advisors that have it. There's an Excel calculator to do this program. It's on the notes on it. There is no figure as such. It's very individual to every farm. So many things can vary. Like, so simple one is coming up and it's starting to become an issue. And while we had probably mentioned it, and we've mentioned it to our own advisors, last year's tax coming this year, that's having an effect. There's cash will be required for that. So your tax structure in a company, not a company, in partnership. Massive variance in tax bills based where you are and your capital write-downs. That's number one. Number two, drawings. That's so varied amongst farms, and there is no right or wrong figure. Sure, if you're at a stage of life where there's 3 or 4 kids in college, sure, that's it. You have to admit. If you're out the other side and they're making a bit of income, then hopefully they're not still coming back looking for a bit of money. So that helps on that side. So that drawing's a big thing, tax a big thing. The other one then is your level of debt. That'll have a massive variance. So if you're potentially you have no debt, then obviously that's less cash required for that. If you're in an early stage of an expansion, there may be debt there to associate with. Other ones then, new entrants will tend to be or people with a young herd. They have the cost of the stock, but they may not have the output, so that'll affect their break even. So to quote a break even is doing everyone else a disjustice, because and it could also mean like we could quote a figure. I'm not going to say a figure now because I'll get caught for saying it, but we could say a figure and say, well, grand, that's what Teagasc said, or break even is that, but it may not, it'd be totally unsuitable for you.
So really, ultimately, what I'm hearing from you is sit down, do the sums, work out where you're actually at from a break-even milk price point of view for your business, and are you in surplus, are you in deficit, and act accordingly really is the message from ourselves.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things I suppose when you say act, that's to say it's a metric, and it can be run 10 times. Like, it's not a big job to do it, like, and you can run it. Like, so the first thing when you run it is to see, well, what's driving it? What is the main thing that's driving my break even? So it'll give you an indication of where is there potential savings too. So you've sat down, looked at the figures. big thing is too, okay, well, milk price is sliding. It's you have higher value milk towards the back end of the year. And we've had John on there a few minutes ago saying there's an ample supply of grass. We have to utilize that. So if we're looking at a bad spring next year, the best time to save money is now, to have it to carry it into next year. So worrying about high price for next year, not doing that now, is, the more we can save now by utilizing the weather we have and the grass growth available. And fundamentally, because he said himself, don't go mad on the fertilizer. Obviously, if the grass is there, he said just before we came on to the online there that the dry matters are improving, so there's more power in the grass. So that should be back correspondent to what we shouldn't be how we feed the cow. Save money there. That money then will be able to be carried forward. Mm. What we do look at, like, is the big thing is with the milk price, is where milk price is going to be next spring. And then believe it or not, the spring doesn't actually have a massive impact, or the milk price, doesn't have a massive impact on your cash flows in the early part, in the first third or first quarter. It's more so what happens with the milk price as we move into April, May, June, July. And what happens there is, because you're a month behind with your milk checks and you don't send a whole lot of milk in that part of the year, well, you don't want a bad price. It has a minimal impact on your overall cash flows. It's more when the big checks start coming through the end of the year. So if milk price is starting to rise and move on forward, very good. If we're still low going into April, May, and it's only starting to rise, at that point it's starting to have a major impact on the overall year. And as a rule of thumb, it used to be about 30,000. So from a working capital point of view, you would need about 30,000 per 100 cows, or 300 a cow on a working capital. So if you were 0 at the start of the year, to the peak when you get to the lowest, you'd be in deficit of about 30,000 per 100 cows. And that'll be either on overdraft or merchant debt or merchant credit, or if you had it in the bank, then you'd be just dipping into the bank. That figure is moving higher now because the feed and fertilizer has gone up. So it's costing us more, and it's tracking, depends where, last year being closer to 50,000 per 100 cows. And so we're estimating somewhere, depending on where the feed and fertilizer go, closer to 40,000. So one way to get through the spring is make as best we can is to save money now that we can carry ourselves through, and then hope that the milk price will rise beyond that on it.
So it's not milk price as such, really, as you say, early in the year, it's really feed budget, and it's costs around that.
Like, obviously, if the milk price, it's the positive to have the higher. Obviously, it's not just saying that it's irrelevant. It just has it's not when the most of the milk checks come in. Like, so, yeah. It's more important, obviously, to have it higher through mid-season when the milk checks are there. But the biggest problem in particularly the majority of farms, is that all your costs are front loaded to the first quarter, and your milk is not there to meet it. So you get this bit of you have all your costs associated with, you're putting out your fertilizer, your feed, you're probably feeding heavier. You have calves, milk replacer, the whole lot that goes with it. AI will start creeping into that type of thing as well at that time, maybe synchronization protocols. So we catch it all, and the milk's just falling on behind it, So it's the hardest time of year to manage it, and I think we start now.
Right. So ultimately that was my next question, in terms of, for the listeners, what should they be doing now, or thinking about, or when you go on farm and you're putting a cash flow plan together in place? And by the sounds of it, it needs to be put in place till next May type of thing.
Yeah, so there's any amount of ways of doing a cash flow. So look, you could there's online ones. We have our own cost control planner. There's a 5-minute cash flow that our rural development specialist developed. So look, you Google it, you get a way of doing a cash flow. There's also the break even there, which is a quicker way just to get yourself lined up. I think within that, then obviously, look, more likely that one of the issues we would have had potentially during the drought is if the way milk price was looking and things like that, if there was going to be a shortage of fodder. That doesn't seem to be an issue now, the way the year came out, which is good, because that put buying fodder in the early part of the next year when a low milk price and high cost would be a very hard cash flow. So one thing is, with all them things, make sure you have enough fodder. If you are a farm that is struggling for fodder, you need to look at are you carrying passenger stock and start offloading them, because carrying them to buy fodder next year, potentially in low milk price, makes no sense. Similarly, towards this year, if there's pasture stock, it's even my own farm. There's a few we're after drying off and send them off to out farms there to take the pressure off the farm. the ones empties and things like that we to reduce the feed budget, to make more grass available to the cows are there, and to balance the thing and have them off the farm. Like, so that's what we'll be looking to do. Other things you look at in your break even then is, again, say, like, some people have done a lot of development out of capital reinvestment. So they did a lot of work last year out of cash flow. And I would see in a lot of scenarios, a lot of farmers have taken on a lot of relatively short-term debt. Probably in fairness to them, in the last number of years, milk price has been fairly strong and profitability has been fairly good. So they were in a position that they're able to pay down debt relatively fast. If that's a thing that's putting pressure on cash flows, they maybe need to go talk to the bank, look and restructuring that. There is potential there, if you are under pressure, to go back and back finance some of the capital expenditure we did over the last year or two as well. So it's basically to buy back your cash flow to bring forward. So there is things you can do, but the trick is to do it in time. There's obviously, if you're going, you can go interest only and all these things, if things are very tight. But the point is to start early and look at it and make sure you're in time ahead, because it's far easier to talk to bank ahead of the game rather than behind it. What we don't want is starting to run up a lot of the short-term debts, merchant debt, own bills and things like that. And it gets into a bit of get your head down, get you into a bit of a hole, and it's hard to get out of it, like predicting low milk price here. So there's a lot of things we can do. And a lot of it, just the problem with when you're talking about cash flow and things like that is the things that work are the basic things.
Yeah, I think people nearly somewhat afraid of that. They think it's there's 101 things to be plugged into an Excel pad to get an answer. But as you said, it's actually relatively straightforward in terms of the templates that are there. And it'll get you 90 or 95% of the way there. You mightn't be bang on 100% accurate, but normally 90 or 95% actually gives you the answer you need, Pat. Is that right?
It's the peace of mind to know where you are. For a lot of farmers, look, they are coming off good years. The level of debt and all that is, if you talk to the banks, on average, is a lot lower. You're not carrying as much debt. Obviously, there's individual cases that there is. Farms are in relatively strong places going forward. There's a lot of people now that they're coming out of their expansion phase as such, if you know what I mean. Like, the herds are maturing and the yields are locking in. So there's a lot of, probably if you go look back to the previous time when there was a low milk price, I think it was 2016 when it dropped down very low as well. Like, now, albeit it started high, dropped for the summer and came high again. I think we averaged about 26 or 27 cent a litre that year. We were in a massive expansion phase that stage. That was a tricky one to carry at that time, like, you know. So yeah, and the other thing, like, it's about being pre-armed. So as long as I'm with Teagasc, and fortunately or unfortunately, I'm around a while now, but we weather these storms all the time. So it's only a matter of looking down. What seems to be happening with the markets is that there's a bit of a standoff from the buyer's point of view, which is understandable. Sure, if things on the way down, why would you buy? There has to be what they're saying anyway, there has to be a corresponding reduction in milk associated with lower prices. So that'll all filter through the system. Yeah. And there's a lot lower, higher cost systems than us that will have to start reducing faster as well. So the whole thing comes together, and unfortunately, getting these peaks and troughs, but that's the way it works. And so it's about, hopefully it'll bounce and it'll turn. And when it turns, it'll start turning fast, in my opinion. Now, that's only an opinion, like, yeah.
Yep, very good. There's a question in there from Justin, I suppose. Can you get access to that kind of cost control cash flow templates if you're not a Teagasc client? And you can. They're available. Ultimately, they'll be available, as you say. If you Google them, you'll ultimately get those simple cash flow. Yeah,
even if you want to break even, you can email myself or James, whoever, send it on. It's not an issue. Like, you know, I mean, it's more important that we're informed and make the action. But we still have half of this year left. While milk price is down, it's not. There may be further knocks. This is the time you actually put a bit of cash together normally, and because a lot of your costs are pulled out of it. So we do everything we can from now on to save cash going forward. And you would have to look. The other thing you would say is sometimes is we prioritize in the wrong area. You have to protect your business going forward. So some people took a payment or a PK holiday, a sale fertility holiday last year because of the high costs. okay, you might got away with it. If you didn't go back in this year, if you do it for two or 3 years in a row, we could have an issue there. So just be careful in what you're doing. That if you make a decision now that's going to impact your farm in a year or two's time, then you won't actually get the benefit of the high price then as such, because you're chasing it. Some people moving back to stock pool, going away from AI. That's going to impact you for years beyond that.
You see those checklists that kind of are out there, and I often see milk recording and stuff on them in terms of which long term, as you say, Pat, it's crazy stuff in terms of for the savings associated in terms of the actual costs incurred longer term will be much, much greater. What I've heard from you today is really it boils down to feed budget. It ultimately is coming down to that you're carrying the right amount of stock for your farm. Don't be carrying passengers. Make sure you have enough winter feed. Know where your costs are at for your individual farm, and that includes all the costs, repayments, taxation, drawings. Maybe go handy on CapEx from a cash flow perspective. Does that mean, I suppose, that projects that are needed should stop, Pat? Because there's one I meant to ask you earlier, and before we finish up, do you know what I mean? That should if these projects
you're building a slab tank for extra storage or something like that?
Exactly.
No,
or maybe adding a few units to the parlour or whatever it is.
No. So, some of them are tied up with grants, and there's timescales and things like that. So it's very easy for us to say stop it, and there's other pressures on the outside. If it's under structured finance, doing it out of cash flow, and hoping for the best, that's all you're doing. There's some very good loan options out there now too. There'll be a new SBCI loan. Should be launched 2 weeks time, I think. Probably if you go on along the previous ones, they'll be unsecured up to $500,000 over 10 years. So there's loan options there that are okay. Interest rates are a bit dearer, but you need to protect your cash flow. So you'd have to look at it, and some people are maybe going doing this thing where they take a lot of it out of cash flow. That's fine, but they may not know their tax position yet. So you go and spend the money on cash flow, and then the tax man comes calling and you go, geez, I don't have the money. That's all planning, so you need to pull the whole thing forward before you work that. But there's no reason if it's structured and you're able to afford it. The key thing there is if you're not able to afford a repayment of it, you're probably not able to afford to take it out of cash flow either.
Yeah.
So it's about, and on a large scale project, that asset, the shed or the slurry tank or even the extra units, that's going to last 15, 20 years. I don't see why we need to pay for them on.
Yeah.
But where we do, as I say, reducing PK 2-3 years in a row, struggling to grow grass next year because of it, having to buy a lot more feed because we're not growing the grass. We might save a bit this year, but it'll cost us more next year. So, just everything you use, make sure it's there for the betterment of the farm, and it's structured, and know the impact it is, whether it be on your break even or your cash flow, just know the impact of it. And I think we're strong enough overall. I suppose we're coming off a good year. This year, profitability wise, will be average or a little bit below average. And it's really where it depends how long it says low for, really. And hopefully, if you look at the experience in the past, it never said too low for too long.
Yeah. So the big message, Pat, ultimately is look at your individual farm situation, know where you're at, and have a plan in place, I suppose, to get you out to next April or May, as you said. It doesn't come a lot of cash obviously in the early parts of the year on most farms. So it's about building cash and carrying cash now to make sure that we get to those stronger milk checks next April, May, June.
The simple answer, James, is don't bring the checkbook to the plough match.
You can attend, but you can't spend. Is that
burger and chips. Maybe if you want to go to the beer tent for an hour, you'll be all right.
Come here, as always, Pat.
We'll meet you in the beer tent for cash flow advice. Yeah.
Very, very informative. We're going to go to that. We've run over.
One more question there, James. I see.
Is there? Yep. There is advice is to talk to your bank early if cash flow will be an issue. do a cash budget, and that's from an industry representative. So you have said that. So now's the time to do your sums, and if you need to talk to somebody, talk to them now rather than till next January or February.
Yeah, so it's far easier, and all these things take time as well. Like so, then what can happen is if you, like I know of farmers in the previous time, and he looked at it, milk price looking poor, and he spoke to his bank. He just said, look, we've gone through cash flows, we may need to go on a principal holiday, basically go interest only on a portion of my loans. Bank were aware of it. As it turned out, the milk price didn't go as bad, or things didn't go back, and he didn't have to avail of it. What harm?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like the bank were happy that the farmer was in control of their figures. They were relatively, and they were speaking to them soon. The thing was in place, it ready to go, and it just didn't happen to be used, and that's more than likely what'll happen. But what can happen in some farms is we get a little bit behind, keep going, get through the spring, and it's busy, and you're working, and next thing it just all sort of builds up on top of you, and then you're going to the bank potentially when you have maybe the merchant or the co-op a little bit more than you normally would, and there's all these type things to work out, and it's just a more complicated situation to try to handle.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to thank you again, Pat, as I said, for coming on. Very informative, and we're on early talking about this, folks, but I suppose the reason we're on early is exactly as we've discussed. And our last listener's point in terms of have that conversation early, know where you're going to be at. If you are feeling that you're going to run into difficulties, I suppose, have a conversation with your local advisor as well. Put a plan in place and talk to your banking institution. All right. As always, it's a busy time on farms, folks. Farm safely, and we'll talk to you on the next webinar.
That's all for this week's bonus episode from the Let's Talk Dairy webinar series, and don't forget to look out for more bonus episodes each week. I'll be back with the usual Dairy Age podcast on Monday, so do listen in then. I'm Stuart Childs, and thanks for listening.